This is Ashley Newby, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, late doctoral students, cultural workers, political organizers, and everyone in between in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Black Studies Podcast. Today, we are talking with Jessica A. Newby, PhD candidate in the Department of History at the Johns Hopkins University. She researches enslaved women, family and kinship, sexuality, violence, and mourning throughout the Black Atlantic during the 18th century. Jessica is a 2024-2025 Mellon ACLS Dissertation Innovation Fellow in recognition of her dissertation, Kinship in Motion, Women in Slavery in 18th Century Jamaica. Kinship in Motion examines a community of enslaved women in Westmoreland Parish, Jamaica, who depend upon their own ingenuity, determination, and empathy to create and maintain a community of both blood and chosen kin to keep themselves and their loved ones alive. How are you doing today, Jessica?
I am doing very well, Dr. Newby. Thank you for having me.
It's so great to have you here today. So you are my sister. So we have a lot of conversations about Black studies all the time, just at home.
Yeah.
So it's really great to be able to sit down and formally have these thoughts put together. So thank you for being here.
Well, thank you again for having me. I have been, as your sister, I am also probably your number one fan and follower, as I have been for most of my life. And it's been great to follow along with the podcast and seeing it evolve over time. And I'm just really grateful to be able to be a part of it in whatever way that I can.
All righty. Well, let's dive in. So let's start with how you got into Black studies and what keeps you committed to the field.
So I feel like I should say right off rip that this is probably going to be a very long answer for me, but I feel like it's necessary. And I think by the time we get to the end of it, hopefully that it'll make sense. When I look back, I see my introduction to Black studies happening mainly because of several pivotal and really transformative relationships throughout my life. And the first one will be very familiar to you, our mother. And my very first awareness of Black history, my first awareness and realization that Black people had a special and distinct history of their own, that whether we're talking about that there was something about Black people or that Blackness was itself a thing, what came through her. And to this day, I still remember when I received it. When we both were really young, probably when I was around 6 or 7, she brought home this VHS tape for us to watch. And for those of you who are out there that are old enough, youngins may not know, but some of us are old enough to remember what VHS tapes were. And this tape was a short film of a story that had actually already aired either on the Reading Rainbow program or PBS or something like that. And it was a narration of a picture book called Follow the Drinking Gourd. And the story itself was about this young girl named Mary who was enslaved on a plantation in antebellum Alabama with her mother and her brother. And the plot was essentially about how they traveled on the Underground Railroad up north to freedom. And they were assisted by this white abolitionist named Pegleg Joe to be reunited with their father, who was sold away before the story began. And I think that there are a few reasons that I've never forgotten it. The first of them was that the story itself was narrated by Morgan Freeman, and he has a pretty distinctive and memorable voice. And second, the story was overlaid with this really beautiful music that was composed by this blues artist called Taj Mahal. And the movie itself made a really huge impression on me as a child for a lot of reasons, but also mainly because it was my earliest recollection that there was something about being Black that was significant. And it was also one of the first of many initiatives that our mother took in training myself, you, and our sister Jasmine to have a very strong knowledge and appreciation of Black history and Black culture and Black people. So, for instance, like that was just like the first of, and if there was any movie that was like on TV, for instance, that she would buy blank VHS tapes and record it. When we were old enough to read, she would take us on weekly trips to the public library and gently slash not so gently steer us toward the books that had Black characters, especially if they were Black girls. She introduced us to a lot of classic texts and authors in the Black literary tradition, so Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston. She took us to Black cultural events in the city, and she brought us up listening to Black musicians. And, we were a very religious household. We were church girls. And so we couldn't listen to a lot of what was known as like secular or worldly music. But I remember the exceptions being made in certain respects. And those exceptions were, for instance, like Billie Holiday and Bessie Smith and Motown and Black artists. And I'm sharing all this information to say that in retrospect now, as a historian in training who has a degree, graduate degree in Black studies, one thing that I've realized and come to have so much more appreciation for is that even though she had extremely limited resources, our mother still managed to essentially develop and implement a strong Black studies curriculum for us in the home. And if you know about the history of Black intellectual production, you know that a lot of what she did tracks with the tradition as a whole, from it being the fact that it was an education that came from a person who did not have who was not formally trained or of the elite academy. Then her not having a lot of material resources, but still making do with what she had. And then also making the subject matter not to be just this information that was fed into us like a machine, but she made it into like a celebration of Blackness, a celebration of who we are. And then finally, it was a curriculum that in the core texts and its implementation, it was also interdisciplinary in its scope and in its content. So our mother is probably the first person that I would think of as being transformative in my introduction to Black studies. A second person that I have to credit here is another person who will be familiar to you, a teacher from our elementary school, whose name at the time was, ironically enough, her name was Jennifer Black. Her name is Jennifer Goins now. And Ms. Goins, if you're listening to this, hi. She was both of our fifth grade teacher. And for a time, a small period of years, I think she was the only Black teacher at our elementary school. And one of the earliest and most consistent memories that I have of elementary school was that Miss Goins was, she was the teacher at our elementary school. And every school has one. She's the teacher that is strict but still cool. The ones where kids just sort of gravitates towards, the ones they're fun, but they will get to you together with a quickness. And I can remember one of the reasons that I wanted to be in her class as a third grader is that I can remember you were 2 years ahead of me. And so I can remember watching you go through her class and have the experiences and wanting to I just remember feeling slightly jealous for the things that I saw that she did for her students and incorporated into the general public school curriculum. For example, one of the major assignments that she had each one of her students do throughout the month of February was to select a particular person from Black history to do a sort of like embodied book report before the entire class about that particular person's life. Mm-hmm. And I say embodied because she truly did encourage students to go all out with the creativity in those projects. And as an example, I'm going to use you as an example and put you on blast here in that. But, you asked me to be on the podcast, so these are the breaks. And when it was your year, the figure that you chose for your embodied book report was Booker T. Washington. There you go, Booker T. Washington. So,
and our mother took me to Goodwill, and we bought a suit, and I dressed up like Booker T. Washington to give my speech.
Yeah, and the speech that you gave was a portion from the Atlanta Compromise. And I just remember feeling like that was just the coolest thing ever to me, that could be school, that could be learning. And so I just wanted to hurry up and blast through third and fourth grade so that it could be my turn, So when 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 it was our turn, Jazz did Lena Horne and I did Billie Holiday. And so in typical mom fashion, she took us to Goodwill to get some dresses that she altered on a sewing machine. And because my figure was Billie Holiday, she went to the dollar store and got some long white gloves for me to wear and some fake gardenias to put in my hair. And just putting together those costumes really helped make our presentations. They helped us feel more excited about not just learning, but also enacting and feeling like we were a part of Black history. And the other really amazing thing that Miss Black did every February of every year was to have the 5th grade class put on a pageant that was essentially a Black History Month celebration before the entire school and to our families and friends. And I remember there was a Black mother at the school who had several of her children also go through Miss Goines' classes, and she sang. And so she would sing Lift Every Voice at the beginning of the pageant, and then the show itself would consist of the students basically putting on a musical review, splash spoken words, splash mini plays and skits of all the things that we had learned during February in class about Black history, arts, and culture and political movements. So in essence, Miss Black was doing double duty, and that she was first teaching her own Black history and she was teaching her own class Black history and Black studies. She was then holding them to an expectation of creating an individual project themselves to engage with it on a personal level. And then she was also allowing us to then go out and teach it to our peers and our families and our communities. And I had to include that story within this broader question of how I came to Black studies, because it just doesn't get any more Black studies centric than what she did than that. And I really don't take for granted that we were able to have those experiences before we ever darkened the doors of a college campus.
Yeah.
So shout out to our mother and shout out to Miss Black and Miss Goines for really laying the early foundation for where we are. Now, we're still on the first question, but I still have to shout out more people.
Of course.
So fast forward a few years, and I have to fast forward a few years to when I came as an undergraduate to Michigan State University. Go Green.
Go White.
That's right. I came in as a humanities major in the Residential College of the Arts and Humanities. It's still called that, the RCAH. But although we could have specializations within that major, I wasn't yet altogether sure of what it was that I wanted to actually specialize in. And so I did what a lot of young college freshmen do, in that I signed up for a variety of classes and I would see which one stuck the most to me. So in addition to my core rec classes, I signed up for Intro to Psych. I signed up for an English class on Black literature, and then I signed up for an African American history class in the spring. I found out very quickly I did not want to go into psychology at all. I really did enjoy my Black English Lit class a lot, but then I took the history class. And that history class was taught by a scholar historian named Pero Dagbovie. And it was a very challenging class, but in the very best way. It was a big class, so it was in an auditorium. And he would come to class and just stand in the front and just talk off the top of his head with no notes. And there really weren't a lot of PowerPoints. It was just him lecturing, talking. It seemed like he had this encyclopedic memory. He could literally quote page numbers of books like it was nothing. And so I remember it being a little intimidating at the time, to the point where I knew that I really, really loved Black history. And that class made me love it even more. But I also felt intimidated at the idea. This was the first introduction I had with an actual historian.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh, this is what historians are.
To be fair, most historians are not Dagbovie.
Yeah.
He is exceptional.
Yeah, he was the first historian. He was the first formally trained historian that I had ever met. And so I remember feeling intimidated at the idea of trying to be anywhere close to what a historian of Black people was. But I still wished that there was some way. I went away from that class wishing that there was still a way that I could take my love for history and combining it with what I knew at the time that I had was this great love that I had for writing and for creative process that had been fostered in us by our mother and by teachers like Miss Black. Well, fast forward to my sophomore year at MSU, and then a new professor came into my college. And that professor is actually a scholar that you've already had on the podcast before, Dr. Austin Jackson.
Listen, when Austin told me that he was gonna leave JMC and go to RCAH, because I was in James Madison, which is a different residential college at Michigan State.
Yeah.
I said, "Oh, my sisters are gonna have you, and you're gonna love them." I actually told him, I was like, "If you think I have potential, wait till you meet my sisters. You're gonna like them more than you like me, but that's okay because I'm very excited for them to be able to take your class."
Yeah, and you told us that we were going to he's an amazing teacher. You're going to love him. And having listened to the episode that you recorded with him multiple times, I have to echo so much of what you said. And that meeting him was really a transformative moment.
It changed our lives.
It literally did.
Literally.
I can remember feeling like when I did meet him and had the chance to talk to him, feeling like, oh my gosh, yes. Fine, like this brilliant professor, please don't go anywhere, please be my mentor, and you know this too, because he is a brilliant teacher and his teaching pedagogy is really just something to be studied.
It is.
And once I remember when I was able to go to his office hours and talk about what classes I had taken thus far and what it was that I liked learning about, what it was that I wanted to pursue, but I still wasn't exactly sure what that looked like. He was just immediately like, oh, well, that's great. You're Black Studies. And I was just like, what? What's Black Studies? Like, what? That's a thing? And as it turns out, yes, Black Studies was not only a thing, it was a thing at MSU.
Yes, it was.
At the time, it was the program for African American and African Studies. Students couldn't major in it back then. I'm aging myself here when I say that, but they could add it to their existing majors as a specialization, and then they also had a PhD program. So that's exactly what I did. I stayed in the RCAH, but I added AAAS to my major specialization. Now, doing that allowed me to choose a particular track within the specialization. I don't remember what it was formally called, but I chose the track that would allow me to take more history classes. And the very next history class that I took was with another historian called Dana Ramey Berry. And again, it was a transformative class for me, obviously, because as most people that are listening to this probably know, Dr. Berry is brilliant, but she is also a very generous teacher. And in her class, I developed an even stronger appreciation for Black women's history, specifically where histories of slavery where Black women were concerned. I should note that I still did not think that I was smart enough to become a historian at the time, but I knew for sure that I wanted to be able to do some aspect of research within Black studies that had to do with enslaved women. After that, I got a work study job at the time, and I think Austin actually helped me get this job. The job was actually working in the AAAS office as an office assistant. And so working in that office was another really pivotal and important moment for me because it allowed me to get an up close and personal look at what it would look like to get a graduate degree in Black Studies. And I knew then that I wanted in. And so there is another program that I know you're familiar with because as with most of the excellent things in our family, you did it first. And that program is called the McNair Scholars Post-Baccalaureate Program.
Shout out to Dr. Curry.
Hi, Dr. Curry. Yes, that's right. Run by Dr. Natavia Curry at MSU. That essentially prepares undergraduates who are interested in graduate education for the graduate school application process. And so having seen you go through McNair and having met Austin and lots of other Black Studies professors that were at MSU at this time, so Dr. Bovey, Dr. Berry,
Shout out to Dr. Stokes.
Yep, Dr. Curtis Stokes, rest in peace. Dr. LaShawn Harris.
Dr. Smitherman.
Yes, Geneva Smitherman. Dr. Adozi. I knew that I wanted to pursue Black Studies at the graduate level. I wasn't exactly sure what I would do once I got there, but I knew that I wanted to go to graduate school for Black Studies. So I had taken another history class as an undergrad during this time, and it was on the Caribbean. And I remember that during this time, I read this book about Jamaica during the 18th century. And historians of slavery during this time period will know that Jamaica was the wealthiest, but also one of the deadliest and most violent of the plantation colonies back then. And even at the time, and this was around 2009, 2010, there was a notable amount of scholarship published about Jamaica, mainly because of how valuable it was to Britain and how notorious it was for its brutality to enslaved people. And one of the reasons that we know that is because because of a particular primary source that's rather notorious in and of itself among scholars of slavery. And it's a collection of diaries that were kept by this English farmer that migrated to Jamaica in 1750, and he remained there for the next 30 or so years until his death in the mid 1780s. Um, I'm not going to say his name. You can just Google Jamaican overseer, and it'll probably come right up. But I will say that the diaries that he kept are noted among historians, but also people who study Jamaica and enslaved life within many disciplines for several reasons. The first is that they were an enormous archive in and of itself. So, as an overseer of a sugar estate and then later on an agricultural pen, he was a dedicated and very meticulous record keeper. And so there's a diary entry for nearly every single day of his 36 years in Jamaica. And he also kept a very detailed report of the weather. And then second, the content of the records themselves provide a very graphic picture of what life in a sugar colony was like in the 18th century for white people as well as for enslaved people. So he kept these detailed records of the labor routines the extremely brutal labor routines that enslaved people who were both transported to Jamaica through the Middle Passage and then those who were born into slavery on the island were subjected to. The diary also has very graphic accounts of the extreme violence that white people subjected enslaved people to. He himself was a sexual predator and a sadist of sorts who forced himself upon hundreds of enslaved women. And so that violence is also present within the diary. Now, when I was an upperclassman at MSU and going through the McNair program, I read a book about him. And although it was a book about him and the author was very forthcoming and rather unapologetic about that focus, rightfully so. I mean, there was still a chapter in the book's latter sections that selected 4 enslaved women that were depicted in the diaries. And this latter chapter of the book piqued my interest the most, primarily because I found myself extremely interested in the lives of these 4 women. And by extension, the experiences of enslaved women in Jamaica in general, and how they all had different experiences and ways of surviving the extremely violent and dangerous conditions of slavery in Jamaica, but also finding ways to circumvent and protest the conditions of slavery and its boundaries and in their own individual ways. That interest led me to selecting enslaved women in Jamaica as the project that I would focus upon as a McNair scholar. And I was relatively certain that it would be what I wanted to focus on when I went to grad school. Now, I didn't end up going straight through from undergrad to grad school. I had a gap of about 6 years. And when I did make the decision to do so, it was the foundation that I had built as an undergrad student within my Black Studies specialization, the work studies job that I had in the AAAS program office, and the McNair Scholars Program that ultimately made me decide to solely apply to Black Studies programs for graduate school that first time that I applied. And fortunately, I was admitted into the African American Studies department at UCLA as a master's student. So those 2 years in LA were really vital for me in a lot of ways. First, I was introduced to and into another community of really brilliant, but also generous and supportive scholars, such as Peter Hudson and Jamila Pierre, Walter Allen, Caroline Streeter, Aisha Finch, Sarah Hagley, Scott Brown. Second, I was now in community with other Black Studies graduate students who had similar educational interests to mine. I was now in a setting where I was learning within a formal space about the actual history of the discipline of Black Studies.
Mm-hmm.
I was reading the core texts by the core authors, some of whom have already been featured on this podcast. And I was really gaining a reminder in some ways, but also a new education of what it actually meant to be a scholar who was intentionally oriented within Black Studies and what that meant. Finally, as a graduate student, I was able to gain an even sharper focus and idea of what it was that I wanted to pursue within the field of Black studies and what it would look like as a career. That was a really, really long way of answering that first question. But to sum it, but hopefully it makes sense. And to sum it up, I just wanted to say I came to Black studies first by means of the relationships that I formed with people within an immediate and extended community. And it really was Black studies itself that helped to facilitate the formation and the extension of that community in a lot of different respects. And I think I remain committed to Black studies because of those relationships that I formed. They're not just professional or academic. It's inherently personal for me. Mm-hmm. Our mother was our first Black studies teacher.
Yeah.
And I can say with confidence, she was my first and will be my most important. And my first Black studies example was her, and then you as my older sister. I view Austin Jackson as my older brother.
Yeah.
He's mentored me as such for many years now. So that's one of the things that keeps me committed to it. A second thing is that again and again, Black studies has allowed me to find and to articulate and improve myself and my work in ways that I did not know were necessary or even possible to do. We can get into this later, but it's given me the methods and the tools by which to do so.
Mm-hmm.
It showed me, even from a really early age, that there was no one right way. There's no one right subject or one right discipline to pose or answer a question. And that it's actually more productive to try and find as many different ones as we can. And that training turned out to be really essential for what was to come once I actually arrived to UCLA as a master's student and started taking up Black studies in a professional sense.
Well, thank you for that. I think that something that occurred to me, which is probably obvious, but until you went through not only our shared trajectory, and then the experiences that you have had in addition to the ones that we share, but the role of storytelling, right?
Mm-hmm.
You being in history right now is definitely reflective of the importance of storytelling and the emphasis that our mother placed on us learning the stories of Black people and Black history. And even our grandparents always telling us the stories of their childhoods growing up in Mississippi and migrating to Michigan, the role that story plays in our relationship to Black studies is foundational. And I'm not sure that occurred to me in that way until just now. So thank you for that revelation about our lives. But I want to build on that and ask you, as someone who's being trained in the discipline of history, but does have a master's degree in Black studies, and then has this, arts and humanities background in undergrad. How do you position yourself in relationship to the fields that you intersect with, particularly given the more conservative background in history, not in history of history, not just of the field of history, but of the specific history department that you are now getting your PhD in?
Yeah. So this is, again, a question that's going to, I'm a historian, so I still have to give more context. You can never have too much context. So what had happened was this came about through a combination of, in retrospect, I think was a combination of intention, but also a set of fortuitous, or whether or not you want to call
divinely
aligned circumstances. Yes. So my interest in enslaved women's history in Jamaica had never gone away, even in the 6 to 7 years that I had between undergrad and my master's program. So even in my very first quarter at UCLA, I was already looking ahead to my master's thesis. And I knew even then that I was going to be writing about enslaved women in Jamaica in some capacity. But I still had some anxiety about that, because I was like, yeah, I'm interested in enslaved women in history, but I'm a Black studies scholar. You know,
Period.
I'm in a Black Studies department. I was intentional. Like, that's what I chose. You know, the historians, they are so brilliant. They are so great, but they are over there and I am over here. And like, I don't know how to mingle, or even like, I don't know how to mingle or eat, like, even if I should mingle in that sense, you know. I had visited history departments as a McNair student back in 2009 and 2010. And the ones that I did were very traditional and conservative in the ways that they taught history and the kinds of dissertations that they produced and the types of scholarship that the historians who taught there produced, which was fine, by the way, which was great. I just knew that that particular way of storytelling
Mm-hmm.
was not, that wasn't who I was. That wasn't the type of work that I knew that I wanted to do. And so, you know, to put it bluntly, I just genuinely did not believe that there was a place for me or for the types of research or the types of inquiries that I wanted to pursue within a history department. At the time, I just didn't see it for me. But when I told my advisor at UCLA, Dr. Hudson, about my research interests, he too he's trained as a historian as well. He still recommended that I read a book about enslaved women and reproduction in 19th century Jamaica called Contested Bodies, that had come out a few years earlier it was also written by a classically trained historian named Sasha Turner. And so I still remember the day that I went to UCLA's library and I got Contested Bodies that same day and I began reading it. And apart from the fact that it was a very well researched and executed book, the thing that made me the most excited about it were the types of questions that she was raising about the archive. She was using primary sources that were by and large written by enslavers and overseers and agents and British abolitionist propaganda or records from the British Parliament. But she was being very intentional in considering and centering enslaved women's perspectives and how she made her arguments. And this was a practice that I saw was kicked into an even higher gear in an article that I found that she wrote called The Nameless and the Forgotten: Maternal Grief, Sacred Protection, and the Archive of Slavery. Not only was she writing from enslaved women's perspectives in that article, she was writing about an enslaved woman from that same archive of the white English overseer that I had such an interest in. She was writing about an enslaved woman in a very particular way.
Mm-hmm.
And it was so resonant with how I wanted to be able to write about enslaved women's stories. And so that really gave me something to think about over the course of the next few months. So fast forward to spring of 2020, I took a Black feminism seminar with Sarah Haley, and she invited several scholars to Zoom into our class, because this was COVID at the time, so that we could talk with them about their works. And one of the main assignments for the course was for each student to be assigned a week of readings, and then they would present to the class about them. And the week that I signed up for was, of course, the one that focused upon histories of slavery for enslaved women in the archive. And one of the texts that we read was an article called Searching for Climax: Black Erotic Lives in Slavery and Freedom. And it was written by two scholars by the names of Jessica Marie Johnson and Trevor Lindsay. And in a nutshell, the article was discussing erotic lives of enslaved women and representations of those sexual lives, or lack thereof of those representations, within popular media, and what that says about our expectations and hesitation towards and uses for enslaved women within the archive when it comes to these historical narratives of pleasure, even in the midst of slavery. And reading that article was another watershed moment for me as a student, because I just had not come across something like that before, particularly not written by scholars who were formally trained as historians. And I realized again that here were two historians, two Black women historians who, like Dr. Turner, were thinking about the inner lives of Black women in ways that I wanted to think about them. And they were articulating those thoughts in ways that I wanted to do in my work, but just didn't quite know how, or that it was even possible up to that time. So I was very excited to read the article. What I was less excited about and nervous about was the fact that Dr. Johnson was one of the scholars that was going to be zooming into that Black feminism seminar class when I was supposed to present and summarize and talk about her work. But as it turned out, the presentation went fine, and then she responded to it very affirmingly. And I can remember her asking me a few questions. One of them was, did I wanted to pursue a PhD and if I had an interest in enslaved women's history. And I, I tried to keep it cute, very demure, very mindful, and saying yes. When in reality, inside, I was thinking, oh my God, yes, I want to do exactly the kind of work that you're doing, caps, caps, caps. And she said, oh, that's great. Well, you should think about applying to my institution. And her institution was Johns Hopkins. And that second part completely threw me for a loop because it was a history department. First of all, because it was a history department and I was in Black Studies. And second, it was Johns Hopkins, which I did not know very much about, apart from the fact that it was a very old department. It's actually the oldest one in the country. And I was conflicted. And because I was conflicted at the time, I just decided I decided that she was just being nice and didn't actually mean it or anything.
Yeah.
So, but in between that time, I came across another book that I just have to cite just because it was another watershed moment for me. And it's also it's written by another guest that you recently had in the podcast. And that's the book is Dispossessed Lives. Enslaved Women Violence in the Archive by Marissa Fuentes. And I do not think that it is possible for me to overstate the impact that reading that book had upon my life. It was a revelation. And I don't use that word lightly. It really was.
I remember, because I remember when you read it and you came and were telling me all about it. You were so excited about the fact that this is what you wanted to do.
Mm-hmm.
And it provided a framework and an example of what Black women's enslaved history can look like, even with the silences and the erasure of the current archives that we have.
Yes, exactly what you said. And another thing that struck me in reading it as a master's student, that this was a book that I could tell was undoubtedly written to be situated within a historical discipline. She was definitely talking to historians in the way that she wrote it, but she was a historian who was first trained as a Black Studies scholar.
Yep.
And I could not get that out of my head. That really did stick with me. So fast forward to a few months later in the fall of 2020, when I was deciding where it was that I was going to apply for my PhD.
The dumpster's fire of the fall of 2020.
Yeah, girl, there was a lot going
on.
So in the midst of all of that, I found myself remembering Dr. Johnson and what she had said. And I couldn't stop thinking about and wondering, like, wait, what if she was not like just being nice? Like, what if she was being serious? What if I could go there and be able to work with her as a graduate student, So I went to the Hopkins website and I looked at the faculty list. And that's where I saw that not only was Dr. Johnson still there as faculty, Sasha Turner was there too. The author of the book that I had read about enslaved women during my very first quarter at UCLA. And that was huge. I really can't. That was when I really had to take a step back and think that regardless of how I thought I didn't fit in with history as a discipline or how the scholarship that I produced wouldn't be welcomed within the historical discipline. Here, there was a situation before me where there were two historians of enslaved women's history at the same institution who I knew from reading their work did understand where I was coming from as a Black Studies scholar who wanted to tell enslaved women's stories from their perspectives in the ways that the Colonial Archive seems to deem as unimportant. Not only that, I've met one of them who told me I should think about applying to the department for my PhD. It just felt like too much of a coincidence and the timing of the circumstances to ignore. So I figured that I at least had to try. But I should be honest here and say that I applied to several departments that fall, and Hopkins was the only history department I applied to. The only one. And it also happened to be the one program I knew I wasn't going to get into. Like, I knew I was not
And
going to
yet,
get in.
it was the first acceptance that you got.
Yeah. 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 Um, I just Yeah, so when you apply to the Hopkins History Department, you give the names of several scholars you're interested in working with should you go there. And so they show your application to those scholars and they provide their input to the admissions committee. So, of course, Dr. Johnson and Dr. Turner were two of the scholars that I put down. But a third was also Dr. Lawrence Jackson, who had a background in history, but was also um, had an appointment within Hopkins English department, and he had extensive experience in writing Black memoir and biography, which was of great interest to me. And so when I was admitted to Hopkins, all three of them became my advisors, and it's just been a really incredible journey since then. And I share all of that to say, and to return to your original question, that my orientation to the field of Black studies, especially now that I do find myself in a history department, has, in retrospect, I can say that it has unfolded the way that it has because Black studies is what brought me into a community with the scholars that do come from the more traditional disciplines, but still share my commitments and my priorities and how they tell and celebrate histories of Black life. These are people who are infinitely smarter than me, and they have the knowledge, the wisdom, and more importantly, they have the willingness and the generosity to train me in a way that allows me to situate myself comfortably within both and multiple intellectual traditions without ever feeling like I have to choose one or stay within one. Like I'm 4 years into my PhD program now, and I can say with a pretty comfortable degree of certainty that making the decision to receive training as a historian has made me what I view myself as I'm a better Black studies scholar in the sense that it's improved my confidence in certain respects. I remember how I spoke a few minutes ago about how I felt in awe of historians when I was in undergrad, but I felt like I could never be like them because I just felt like it was beyond me. And I can, like, in retrospect, I can say that that was just like a very reductive and even erroneous way of thinking, not just about myself, but, in a moment of like self-reflection, that was a very limited way of thinking about Black studies.
Yeah.
Like this idea that I think is a lot more prevalent than I think but people want to admit, that traditional disciplines are somehow harder or more difficult or more rigorous than Black studies. And now that I have been in both, now that I have been exposed to training in both fields, I can say that that's absolutely not the case. Once you really get into the nitty gritty of Black studies and understanding its depth and its methodologies, particularly when you are seeking to do it within a more traditional discipline, you realize that it's actually much harder to do what we do. And that was something that I myself had to be corrected and brought to understand through a lot of reading, through the community that I was introduced to and formed over time, and then through actually doing, research. Granted, there are things that I had to learn about the historical discipline too, methodologically, text I had to read and debates I had to familiarize myself with in order to not only do the work that I want to do in enslaved women's history, but to do it rigorously and effectively in a way that cannot be easily dismissed as uninformed or non-rigorous. I'm sure there are still a lot of historians who may not like the kind of work that I do or not be concerned with the same types of inquiries that I pursue or interested in the types of questions that I ask. But it's, but if you read my work, if you look at the footnotes, there's no way that it can be said that I am uninformed or out of my depth within the field of history.
Yeah.
I've done the work.
Yeah.
I have a grasp of the field, and I am still choosing to approach it from this way, with a Black studies centered lens. Du Bois was W. Du Bois was a scholar, a Black Studies scholar who could hang with the historians. He could hang with the sociologists. He could hang with the novelists. He could hang with the poets. And I think that having that fluency in disciplines and the ability to go between is really important. Not just because of the intellectual rigor of it all, but because it gave him this really important perspective that there is no one so-called all-knowing discipline that has the final say on a subject.
Mhm.
Du Bois knew that the historians didn't know everything that there was to know, that the sociologists didn't know everything, that the politicians didn't know everything, that there was no one master language of communication that's superior to one another. But I think that you come to that you reach that realization a lot sooner than you may have when you've done the work of learning how to converse in and with them all at once. And I think that's the brilliance of Black Studies, is that it brings you that perspective. So yeah, while being trained as a historian has made me a better Black Studies scholar, I would say that it's even more so in the reverse, that being a Black Studies scholar has also made me a better historian. And I
Facts.
honestly, Black Studies is the only way that I could have become a historian. I
Yeah,
don't think that I could have come to it any other way.
I would agree with that. And like as someone who does get to witness the work that you do, and the amount of like physical actual labor that you put in behind the work that you do, I know for a fact that like Black studies is it's central and it's necessary for you to be able to do this work. And having that Black studies training made you be able to engage with that archive in a way that you didn't see as possible
Yeah.
6 years ago. So it's definitely allowed for you to do work that I am super excited about and very, very proud of you for pursuing. And I actually want to hear more about that work. So, um, talk a little bit more. Like you've alluded to the archive that you work with and the influences that you've had, but do you want to say a little bit more about your actual dissertation research and the projects that have come from that, including the Slavery in Motion um, curation of the exhibit we also got to speak with the artist who worked on that for the podcast. So,
Yeah. So I spoke earlier about the book that the primary book that's written about the English overseer in Jamaica. There were 4 enslaved women who were cited in the book, and I wrote about 2 of them in my master's thesis. Later on, when I came to Hopkins, there's this requirement that all students have to complete called the first year paper. And that's where you write what's essentially a paper where you present a piece of original research that you've done over the course of your first year. And Dr. Johnson described it to me as essentially your introduction to the department. What are you interested in? What are the archives you're into? Who are you in conversation with? And what are your research methods? So when I was deciding what it was I was going to write my first year paper on, I decided to revisit some elements from my master's thesis, particularly an aspect where I wrote about one of the enslaved women from the English overseer's diaries. She was a young African woman who was brought to Jamaica as a girl. Her name was Malia. The overseer renamed her to something else, and that's the name that she's typically called within most secondary sources. But I refer to her as Malia. Several years after she came into Jamaica, she had a daughter named Sylvia, and the overseer separated Malia and Sylvia when she was just 15 months old, so that he could hire Malia out to work on another plantation. And Sylvia died while her mother was away. Roughly about 1 year later, Malia began running away, and she kept doing it until she had reached at least 14 different escapes. And after her 14th attempt and recapture, her enslaver sold her to another who took her away from Jamaica to Savannah, Georgia. And because she was the enslaved person in the diary who had made all of these escapes and efforts at resistance, the author of that book called her the slave rebel. Um, and her name was Malia, but the overseer had renamed her, I think I said earlier. And that was the name that was carried on into other scholarly publications too. And that little detail bothered me, as did some of the things that I saw that he wrote about her that seemed to be very heavily shaped by the overseer's perspective and how he would have viewed her. I just felt like there was more to the story about her than what other historians had really attempted to see up until that point. So for the first time, I really considered taking on a challenge to actively engage with this historiography about Malia and push back against some of it, and then other also parts to say, hey, this is fine, but there are some other really important pieces that really aren't being addressed, and here's how we might think about changing that. Um, and so a bit of context about the archival documents themselves. For anyone who doesn't know, the diary themselves are actually physically housed at Yale University, but they've also been completely digitized since 2013, and they're available to anyone online. And I just have this really clear memory of being a master's student and going to looking at the diaries myself. And the reason I have that memory is that it's actually kind of traumatic, because I looked at it and I felt just so sad because the handwriting just seemed like chicken scratch to me, and I didn't think I was ever going to be able to read it. But I knew that I had turned a major corner from that moment in my master's program to when I went back to look at the diaries as a first-year PhD student, because when I went back to look at the diaries, I had this new sense of confidence, and even determination that I was going to figure out a way to read the handwriting and see what more I could find within the diaries to tell a different story about Malia than what a lot of other scholars had done so far. And as it turned out, I found a lot.
Yeah, you have.
And I used that material to tell a different story. And that story became a paper called Country Named Malia. And that paper was another watershed moment for me, because I think it was the first time that I felt like, okay, maybe I do have something notable to say here to this discipline. Maybe I can rock with the historians while also staying in my Black studies rhythm. And I thought at the time, I'm going to keep this small, and I'm going to keep it tight, and I'm going to keep it contained. And at first I thought that going forward, that
You
meant
thought.
I thought that I was just going to write a dissertation about Malia, just one person. But then shortly after my first year, that started to change. Towards the end of the paper, I wrote about this one experience that Malia had after being recaptured and returned from one of her escapes. Her owner was getting ready to lock her in a set of iron ankle restraints when he suddenly stopped, and he writes that he did so because there was another enslaved woman named Egypt Lucy there who asked him not to. And because she asked, he literally described it as an intercession. Malia was kept out of restraints that night. And I wrote about that scene in the diary in the paper Country Named Malia because I was responding slash questioning this characterization that a previous historian had made about Malia, that because she ran away so frequently and because she did things like stealing food from other enslaved people and got into arguments with a few people, that she was, antisocial. That's a word that he used to describe her. And so I was including this scene in my paper because it was just one of the examples that I found in reading the diary for myself, and not just depending upon the scenes that other historians that were including in secondary source books helped me to form a different perspective of her, not just as this African woman or just as a field hand, but also as a mother, but also as someone who meant something else to another person. And so that sent me down a rabbit hole because I wanted to see if I could find more about the nature of this relationship between Malia and Egypt Lucy. But I was also very intrigued as to why the overseer had agreed not to punish Malia just because this other enslaved woman asked him not to. What made her so special? And those two questions sent me down a rabbit hole of finding out as much as I could about Egypt Lucy's life. And I discovered that the more I found out about her, the more insight I received about other seemingly unrelated aspects of Malia's life that actually really were related and important. And it kept happening that way, where I would come across and meet one enslaved woman within this archive. And every time I thought I was done, she would say, okay, no, now you have to meet this other person. Now you have to meet this other person, and this story will help you understand this about me. And if you meet her, you'll have to understand this about my child. And it got to the point where all of the connections between enslaved women that I was seeing were so deep and just so entrenched that I really couldn't separate them from one another without feeling like I was admitting a really crucial piece of the puzzle and a huge piece of the narrative. So in the fall of 2023, this was around the time that I was gearing up to write my prospectus, it dawned on me that that was the point. There was not just one woman's story to be told here, that it was all of their story, and that's how it needed to be told. So that's how we went from Country Named Malia, the paper, to the dissertation that is now Kinship in Motion: Women in Slavery in Jamaica. And one last thing that I want to say is that I really don't take it for granted that my coming to Hopkins and being here over the past 4 years has placed me in community with so many different scholars and researchers and artists. But they're both inside and outside of the academy, and they've enabled me to be able to have what I really think is the best of both worlds in learning and writing and sharing enslaved women's stories. And that kind of gets right into what you were saying about the Slavery in Motion project. Um, and that is a collaboration that came out of what's called the Diaspora Solidarities Lab, which was a Mellon-funded multi-institutional Black feminist partnership that was led by PIs Dr. Yolanda Figueroa Vasquez and my advisor, Dr. Jessica Marie Johnson. It's spread across multiple universities, and it's composed of a number of labs of undergrads, grad students, faculty, and community partners. And I came into the DSL by means of a branch called the Community Knowledge Lab. And the Community Knowledge Lab is comprised of smaller micro labs that create and collaborate on projects that are related to community and indigenous knowledge practices. And the micro lab that I was a part of, I formed with my colleague Kevin and Asen, and it's called the Remains and Archive Micro Lab. And Remains is a micro lab that collaborates on interdisciplinary projects. It's comprised of scholars from different disciplines. I'm in history, Kevin is in faculty of education, and our third lab member, Samantha Stevens, is in the Department of English at University of Virginia. And so we do projects that are grounded in grief and mourning through a variety of different mediums. Now, in 2023, as a lab, we started to brainstorm what it would look like if we were to try to apply some of the principles of the lab and our core philosophy to a project that would engage within archives of slavery. And more specifically, archives of slavery that have to do with the lives of enslaved women. And so this is where the paper Country Named Malia provided us with a really concrete starting point towards that end. And so we wanted to be able to create a project that would amplify the perspectives of enslaved women like Malia, and to bring an ethic of care to that project that was not just legible to people within the university and the academy, but a project that would be legible to people and engaging to people from all the walks of life outside of the academy.
Mm-hmm.
And art was a way that we started to brainstorm a way that we could do, because at the time there were already plans in the works for the DSL's closing symposium in the fall of 2024. It took place at the Avery Research Center for African American History and Culture in Charleston, South Carolina, a project that Kevin was co-curating with Dr. Mary Pena. And so when we started to brainstorm what Remains' contribution to that event would be, we did so with the knowledge that it would be within this space that was already so rich with a history of its own for African American history and art. And so we wanted to find a way to make our contribution honor the history and the physicality of that space. And so we decided to tap into the first an overall ecosystem of artists and community partners that we already had within the DSL, some of whom were very close friends of ours, and also travel a little bit outside of that ecosystem as well. So it's a combination of it's a collaboration between a combination of people who are both within the DSL's ecosystem and then also outside of it. And so we pitched this project to 4 different Black women artists. The first was a Jamaican-based artist named Romaine McNeil, who I did not know personally prior to this project. I literally was just following her on Instagram. And it was really important to me to have a perspective and a contribution from a Jamaican artist for a project that was grounded in Jamaican history. And Romaine actually happens to be from the very same parish that Malia was enslaved in. So that was also a fortuitous, I didn't know that, but it happened to be a very fortuitous / divine, whatever way you want to envision it, um, um, introduction to happen. Another was Julia Mallory, who was a community fellow and an artist and a poet that does a lot of really impactful scholarship and activism and grief work. Another was our very close and dear friend Tatiana Esch, who is a very talented artist and the DSL project manager based in New York. And then Dr. Johnson introduced me to an extremely talented young lady named Shoshana Rogers, who is a student at Morgan State University and a very talented artist and filmmaker. And fortunately for us, they were all very receptive to the project and they said yes. And so over the next year or so, myself and the 4 artists communicated with one another through email correspondence, where I provided them with pieces of my own writing that I had done on Malia and other enslaved women in the diary. I provided them with excerpts from the archives themselves. I answered questions that they had, and we had several virtual meetings that helped them brainstorm for their individual pieces in the collection. And a year and a half later, what we came up with was Slavery in Motion, which was a collection of several different pieces. So there's paintings, there is written poetry, audio recordings, short film, and music that just came out so much more. It exceeded any expectations or
That's
hopes
fabulous.
that I had for it. And if people are interested in learning more about the project, I really would recommend that they go to listen to the podcast episode that we did with the artists a few months ago where they were able to talk about it. And they can also go online to
The Baltimore Museum of
Yep,
Art.
to the YouTube channel of the Baltimore Museum of Art and also to Johns Hopkins YouTube channel where we did a live discussion and presentation of the pieces themselves at the Baltimore Museum of Art a couple of months ago. So all of that is also viewable online too. So yeah, that's the Slavery in Motion project.
I just want to say once again that I'm so, so proud of you um, for that project, but also just for the care that you have taken in telling these women's stories and ensuring that the things that they experienced and the relationships that they had with each other are looked at
Yeah.
in a way that does not center their tormentor.
Yeah.
You're piecing together fragments of their lives in ways that decenter him and really look at the ways in which they used each other, they leaned on each other in order to survive an unsurvivable situation. Um, and I'm really the Slavery in Motion project was absolutely beautiful, but I'm also just very proud of the amount of effort and care that I witness you put into this work. So I just have to throw that out there. I'm extremely proud. And I'm very, very excited about your dissertation and where this work is going to go. I'm excited about the contribution that it's making to history and to Black studies. And in that vein, what excites you about the future of Black studies? Or what are the things you think other scholars should be scholars, activists, artists? What are the things that all of those of us who consider ourselves to be Black studies should be thinking about for the future?
Yeah. I don't know if what I'm about to say, I don't know if excited is the word that I should use, but I think it does fill me with resolve and it does make me resolved and steeled and even a bit ready for the future. And I do think that it is something that we should be thinking about, not just for the future of our field, but also for our future, capital O, capital F, our future in general.
Mhm.
Listen to Black women is not just a platitude or a
Yeah.
catchy slogan. It's a lesson, but I also think that it's a strategy, and I think that in our present moment, it's going to be really important that we meditate on what that means.
Yeah.
And that's not just something that I am saying out there to everybody else. That's something that I have, especially as of late, have been really intentional in trying to practice in my own life, because I've seen and continue to personally experience how and transformative like that can be. Like, even now in this conversation we've had over the past hour, I can identify multiple times like the value of that statement, the
Mhm.
value of listening to Black women in so many different situations and contexts in our lives, and also expanding our understanding of what listening and hearing can mean.
Yeah.
Like, so listen to Black women, like, for example, listening to Black women in our lives has meant listening to our mother. It's meant listening to Miss Black / Miss Goins and what they literally said to us, but then also listening in the sense of observation,
Yeah.
reflection,
Mhm.
reflecting on their pedagogy as Black mothers themselves, as Black teachers, as Black women. And I think it's important to note that listening is a practice that evolves and it changes and it expands over time,
Mhm.
because we couldn't fully hear or appreciate them and the significance of what they were doing as children, because we were children. We listened and we heard in a certain capacity. But now that we are Black women ourselves, with you as a mother and me and you both as aunties, with you as a doctor and an educator, and with me as a soon-to-be doctor, I think we listen to them, we reflect upon them, we hear them with so much differently in retrospect. And that's a good thing,
Mhm.
because I think that it means that it's not a static thing. Like, in one of the advising meetings that I've had with Dr. Turner, she asked me this profound question that months later I have still been meditating over. And she asked me to really, it was almost like a rhetorical question that she wanted me to just be considering, to just keep in the back of my mind. And she asked me, "What is Malia teaching you?" And that question has had me turned out in the best kind of way, because there's so many different ways to consider it. And one of them, I think, is to relate it back to that to relate it back to listen to Black women. What happens if we listen to Malia? What happens if we listen to her and other enslaved women like her in the archives and take them seriously as people who have the ability to speak to us,
Yeah.
even beyond the grave, even within the archives that are written by their oppressors? What if we still go to those archives to listen for them? What is it that we can hear? And in that hearing, what is it that they can teach us? Like, yeah, like, things are bad right now.
Mhm.
Every day is like it's a nightmare that we just can't seem to wake up from. But also, and relatedly, and I want to echo something. It's something that I've heard, like Dr. Fuentes spoke about it and several other scholars. Like, I don't think that I can emphasize this highly enough. For instance, like, someone who studies for enslaved people, the apocalypse came.
Yeah.
It happened. For enslaved people, especially Africans like Malia, who were taken from their homes into the New World, who were taken into Atlantic slavery, and every horrific thing that followed after that, that was the end of the world as they knew it. There are, and I'm not being hyperbolic when I say that, there are other historians like Stephanie Smallwood and Vincent Brown, who talk about the Middle Passage as being this existential, apocalyptic event that enslaved people spent the rest of their lives trying to recover from. And if not recover from it, then at least survive it.
Mhm.
Many of them did not, but many of them did. And, you know, one of the things that Dr. Johnson has said to me on multiple occasions is that histories of slavery are meant to radicalize us. And when I hear someone say that, what I might add to that is when you study histories of slavery, please understand that you're literally seeing how millions of people try to survive in the aftermath in an ongoing apocalypse that lasted for centuries. You know, so when I think about Malia, I think about her as she first appears in the diary. She appears as this 15-year-old girl, a child who was taken into the slave trade, separated from her family and homeland, probably forever, and forced to spend the next 13 years of her life in this living hell. You know, one of the thoughts that really crushes me when I think about that is there were probably so many times that she probably thought and believed that the end of the world had come. She was cut off from her kin forever. And for Africans, that was a fate that was worse than death, and that no one would ever remember her name or even care that she had ever lived. Right? But, and this is where my sadness gets tempered with something like hope, that wasn't true. Even if she couldn't see it, even if she could not see it, that wasn't the end of her story. Because we are sitting here and we know that someone would remember her name. Somebody would remember that she had lived. And it goes even deeper than that, you know, like, and this, like, I get chills when I think about this, is that Malia had little to no practical way of knowing that her owner was keeping a diary, you know? And even if she knew that he had one, she didn't know what he was writing in it. Or that whenever she did something to step out of line, whenever she did something to contest slavery's boundaries, he would go back and record it and preserve, and those records would be preserved for decades by his ancestors and their ancestors and their ancestors. And then some family from the British nobility would choose to preserve the records extraordinarily well for literal centuries, so that one day somebody, another Black woman, would go looking for her and make sure that she and her story would be remembered. And the thing about it is that, like, Malia didn't know that, and she didn't have to know that. In her moment, it wasn't her job to have all of that, to have all of those answers. It wasn't her job to have that foresight. The only thing that she had to do to secure that future was to keep moving. Like, just keep moving, just keep fighting. That was the work, the work for her. And I think that it's worth pointing out that none of those things that she did were even about ending slavery. You know, like, her running away 14 times did not put a dent into and abolishing the Atlantic slave trade. It wasn't her. It didn't upend the entire system of slavery in Jamaica or the Caribbean. That job and that work were for somebody else. Some days the work was about running away and staying away for weeks, but some days the work was about her staying away for just an hour. You know, so that she could get a few moments of rest and peace for herself. But all of those days and all of those works and all of those things that she did mattered, because although they didn't end her slavery or anyone else's slavery, what they did do was, first, they did two things. First, they made slavery work a little bit less that day. Another thing that they made a record. They made a place for her in history. So it was work that she did for herself in that moment, but it's work that she did for us now. And because we are in Black studies, being in Black studies helps you appreciate all the more that within our intellectual tradition, time and knowledge production, and also the people who produce knowledge, are not static. They do not remain confined to the past. That's what it means when my advisor asks me, what is Malia teaching you? It means that she and other figures of the past are still talking to us. They still have things to teach us, and we have to listen to them now more than we ever did before, you know? So what excites me about Black studies is that like I have just found that listening, like the work is to just keep going, do your work, and listen to Black women. Because
Period.
we always be talking.
Right. And we usually be right.
Okay?
So
Facts.
thank you so, so, so much, Jess. It's been great to be able to talk to you again, to have a record of our talking,
Yeah.
and to really just reflect on the trajectory of your journey. I know I tell you all the time, but I really am so proud. And I'm so excited about the work that you're doing, the work that is to come, and the lessons that we will all be able to learn from Malia due to that work. So,
I tell people all the time, and because we are putting this on the record, I really am just trying to be more like my older sister. For real. Like, that's what I'm just out here trying to be. I'm just trying to be more like you. So I am immensely proud of you, and I'm immensely grateful that we get to do this work. I'm grateful that I've been able to observe you do this work, and I'm also grateful that we get to do this work alongside each other. It means a lot.
I agree. It's special, and I'm very thankful for that as well. So, now we have to go pick up my daughter. So, we'll end it there. But thanks again for being on.
Thank you so much for having me.